Our bot is okay. All the other bots are. Well, okay. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you again. It's an honor to be invited the first time, but I feel like it's very special to be invited back into a community. So that is very special for me. So thank you for having me back and yeah, getting to talk about post-plagiarism and academic integrity. So this is my research area. And as Maha mentioned, I tend to scaffold my thinking a little bit, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the session today, but to kind of set the stage a little bit. Wanted to ensure that I'll have the chat open and I welcome you to participate in the chat throughout. I think this is in line with other Equity Unbound events that I've participated in as a participant and a presenter. So you engaging through it and sharing your ideas and challenges, challenges to my thinking as well is also very helpful. Wanted to start in a good way by recognizing that I'm joining you today and paying tribute to the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which is where I'm located in Calgary. I'll show you a map in just a minute in case your geography of Canada is a little fuzzy. I know that sometimes when I travel to different places, I have a general idea, and then to help someone locate in their space helps me to orient to where they are. So I'm in the province of Alberta, in the city of Calgary, which is includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, who include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And the city where I live, the city of Calgary, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Yes, as Maha mentioned in the meeting chat, if you live in a place where land acknowledgements, territorial acknowledgements are part of what you do to honor the Indigenous peoples where you are, please feel free to add yours in the chat. So, as I mentioned, I'm joining you today from Calgary, from the Western province of Alberta, where I live and work. And you on this slide, you may be able to see the map is in gray, and I need to probably do a better job next time with a star so it stands out a little bit more. But on the second to left province is a yellow star near the bottom of the province. That's to indicate the city of Calgary, which is best known for two things. One is the annual Calgary Stampede, which is a summer festival that we have to celebrate rodeo culture, Western culture, cowboy, cowgirl culture. And the other thing that Calgary, of course, is known for was the 1988 Olympics. And so as well, you'll see my research partner there looking over my shoulder. That's one of my cats, Georgie. We have two of them, and Georgie often accompanies me on these intellectual journeys. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm living, where I come from. I've been in Calgary for over 30 years, so it's home now. This also helps me to kind of situate in this work because the academic integrity that we'll talk about is culturally and contextually bounded. So I'll start by saying that I acknowledge that the work that I do is framed within these cultural boundaries. So I may say some things today that may or may not resonate with you depending on where you're from. And it might be an opportunity to reflect on the cultural and contextual bounding of your understandings of academic integrity and plagiarism and post-plagiarism. So Maha mentioned the provenance of this work. Today's talk is framed within three books. Maha mentioned you have Plagiarism in Higher Education in your library. So that was the 2021 book where the notion of post-plagiarism first kind of occurred to me. And it was in response, we have these ongoing dialogues, either in real time or through our reading with other scholars. And my work has been pretty heavily influenced by a plagiarism scholar who's now retired, and her name is Rebecca Moore Howard. I'll talk a little bit about her later on. But in her work and framing as plagiarism, Rebecca Moore Howard, Professor Howard, is now a professor emerita at Syracuse University. She's a compositionist and works a lot with students who speak English as an additional language, who in the United States would be international students very often, and was really perturbed and distressed by the kind of discrimination and racism against students learning English as an additional language, particularly when it came to plagiarism, and advocated in some of her early work in the 90s and 2000s that we should just take the word plagiarism and throw it out of our policies. One of the titles of one of her articles is "Don't Police, Just Teach." And she really advocated for, I think, what we would call today compassionate pedagogy. But back in those days, that framing wasn't used, and her ideas were considered a little bit radical around plagiarism. But she's really heavily influenced my work because I started thinking about, well, what if we reframed our thinking around it? And then when artificial intelligence came on the scene, that's when I started thinking about post-plagiarism. So that's just kind of a little bit about the provenance of the work, some of the scholars who've influenced me. And if you're interested in sort of research and scholarship around plagiarism, I recommend Becky Moore Howard's work because it was very insightful for me and very helpful and continues to be. I go back and I reread her work and learn new things each time. So in terms of our time together here today, just wanting to acknowledge, I mean, we've got these massive topics around Gen AI, and I know you've talked about this in this community before. We won't be able to tackle all of the concerns around Gen AI. It's too much for any one session or even one series. And we know that the conversations will be ongoing. And we also know that as people work in the field, that their thinking evolves over time. And so just recognizing that where we were with this 2 years ago may not be where we are today. So we're going to focus today on academic integrity, plagiarism, and post-plagiarism for artificial intelligence. And I also just kind of wanted to say that I tend to scaffold. So as Maha mentioned in her very kind introduction, I will think about something and then take it away, digest it, come back, refine it. So you may see some slides that you've seen in other presentations, and there's new things because I like to kind of involve the folks that I work with in community sort of in my process as I learn and grow as a scholar and a teacher. And so inviting you to come along that journey with me that includes some work that I've done before and some new work. So much of the framing around academic integrity is changing globally. And one of the projects that I've worked on in the past couple of years, I guess, is the second handbook of academic integrity. The first handbook was led by a scholar named Tracy Brettag, who's passed away, and I got a chance to work on the second one. I was the editor-in-chief, worked with a team of 9 section editors, so they were like the team leads, and collectively we have 112 chapters in the handbook from 145 authors all over the world. Part of my job was to read the handbook, read all of the chapters, and then draw a through line. And this was one of those times when I had to sit with it because the through line didn't seem evident to me across what became a 3-volume book. But as I sat with it, this framework around comprehensive academic integrity emerged. This kind of synthesizes some of the main ideas in the handbook. And I have a colleague in Canada and British Columbia who calls this the colorful swirly donut of integrity. His name's Kieran Ford, so I'll give him a shout out at the University of British Columbia. So I'll take you through this to kind of show you how some of the global thinking around academic integrity is changing, because I think it can be relevant to our conversations about teaching, learning, and supporting students. So using Kieran's idea of swirls, we can look on the right-hand side at the orange swirl, a yellow-orange swirl in student academic conduct. This is kind of, at least in North America, a historical framing around academic integrity, student cheating, student examination cheating, plagiarism, those kinds of things. And we know that student life is different than it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s. And students are being invited into spaces where they weren't in decades past, particularly around things like research. Many universities now will have undergraduate research programs or opportunities for students, and more master's and doctoral students will be expected to publish and present in their graduate programs or postgraduate programs, depending on that vocabulary nomenclature, depending where you live. So the idea of bringing students into publication ethics and research integrity and ethics is important now compared with generations past, because this is also part of a student experience, even at the undergraduate level. And so these become important topics related to academic integrity. So we can't really decouple research integrity from academic integrity anymore. And nor can we decouple instructional ethics from academic integrity in thinking about educator responsibilities for ethical assessment, which is another big piece of the puzzle, probably its own piece of the puzzle, its own swirl here. Too big to think about today, but thinking about the role of educators in assessment with regards to academic integrity. So one of the things that we might talk about, for example, with AI, you may have heard of a practice called white texting. I'm not sure if folks here would have learned, or you might know it by another name, where this happened, I think, in the early days of ChatGPT, but as I understand from talking with some colleagues, still happens, in which an instructor would set an assignment in Word, for example. They'd write up the assignment instructions in Word, and somewhere in that document, they would embed some ridiculous text. So let's say your assignment was about, I don't know, physics, but in the assignment, they would embed the text, kangaroos dancing. But then they would take the text, change it to white font, and make it very small so that someone looking at a Word document couldn't see it. But if students copy and paste the instructions into an LLM, like ChatGPT, for example, and ask the AI app to do their homework for them, that the result would contain the ridiculous words like kangaroos dancing, which obviously would have nothing to do in a physics assignment. And then the instructor would be able to say, aha, gotcha. You cheated because unless you had used one of these apps or cut and pasted, then you wouldn't have kangaroos dancing in your physics assignment. These kind of assessment tactics are often considered controversial at best, deceptive, and covert, and so may serve to exacerbate antagonistic or adversarial relationships with students. So thinking about the ways that we can demonstrate our academic integrity through ethical assessment rather than tactics that might focus on a gotcha opportunity for an educator, and thinking about ways that we can really challenge and resist those approaches that are largely punitive in nature. And then, of course, thinking about institutional and ethical leadership, and then students who work or live and study in institutions that might be corrupt. And we know that academic integrity is often only seen to do with academics, but can in some contexts include other expectations, bribery, in some places, sex for grade schemes that necessarily affect the integrity of the overall educational ecosystem. More and more in the handbook, what we were seeing was scholars and experts and pedagogues calling for an integrated and holistic approach to academic integrity, where we could talk about all of these things, since the word integrity itself means to make whole, and thinking about academic integrity as a foundation for ethical decision-making in everyday life. It doesn't mean that we're perfect, doesn't mean that we never make mistakes. We all make mistakes every day. But this idea of having an opportunity and a space to practice and ask questions. When I say practice, I mean practice ethical decision-making, whatever that might mean in a context, so that at the end, we as professionals are demonstrating our ethical decision-making at the same time as we're cultivating students into ethical professionals or members of society themselves. So this framing is really an evolution and a challenge to historical definitions that really pit students against teachers, or students against the administration, or sometimes teachers against the administration. Thinking about the way that we can take this holistic view around academic integrity. Now this, our handbook does have some chapters on artificial intelligence. It wasn't the focus of the handbook. It contained all kinds of different topics, but this thinking came from writers and contributors all over the world. And maybe I'll just shift back to, thank you, Caroline, for sharing that, that resource there. Maybe one thing I'll just do here is talk a little bit about kind of one of my pet peeves, which is when people misuse the phrase academic integrity. So during COVID, I put together this timeline with a couple of grad students, and it was published in an article that we wrote on the connections between mental well-being, mental health, and academic integrity, and really tried to sort of disentangle some of the language that's used. When I hear people say, I'm dealing with a case of academic integrity, or I'm investigating academic integrity, it really gets on my nerves because we don't investigate or deal with integrity. We should celebrate integrity and promote it. And it's about education and skill building and helping students bring the best of themselves to our learning spaces. But as an educator, there might come that moment, that critical incident of a moment where you either know or suspect that there's been a breach of integrity. So thinking about the language and the words that we use around a breach of integrity or a violation of integrity, which in many contexts could just be called academic misconduct. And then if in this moment as an educator, you're like, oh, something's gone wrong here, what do I do? Thinking about this gray area here for educators because it's often a moment that can create a lot of emotional distress for the educator. And this is not acknowledged very much in the literature, but the literature that we have found showed that educators may experience pretty high levels of stress when they find they have to report an incident of misconduct. They may or may not know how to report it. They may or may not want to report it for a variety of reasons. They may not want to jeopardize the student's future, or they may not want repercussions from an administrator who might not support them. Or if they're precariously employed, they may fear for job loss if they are labeled as a troublemaker. And so there's psychological impact for educators, emotional labor that's involved in this process. But then we move into this area or this part of the continuum where it's academic misconduct. And I'll talk a little bit more about these breaches of integrity in just a moment and how we frame them in some of our understandings around academic integrity. But this is basically, okay, we think something's gone wrong. We initiate an investigation or a case management. There might be a hearing or a sanction, and later on there might be an appeal around that. And so there's these different processes at different ends of the continuum. So I just kind of wanted to frame our conversation today by starting with the idea of academic integrity as something to be celebrated, whereas academic misconduct is something to be addressed or investigated, and not whitewashing these terms out of for political correctness. And so you'll hear me use these two different terms, academic integrity and academic misconduct, in my work. But for people who do work in the academic misconduct side of the house, if you will, it can be kind of soul-crushing work for those who have a heavy administrative load around investigations and case management. And it can seem that the percentage of students who don't cheat is quite small, and that people who intentionally cheat, students who intentionally cheat are the majority. And even some of the research that exists over a period of time will say that 50 to 90% of undergraduate students might engage in misconduct. So this kind of bell curve has kind of a skewed bias in terms of perception. And then when we look at what the research might show about cheating in general and cheating in society, we can actually see that the bell curve is a normal bell curve. And at one end of the continuum, we have a small percentage of outlier students who never cheat. Bless them. And we wish most students were like them. And at the other end of the continuum, we have students, a small percentage, who may intentionally and maliciously cheat, but these are also a minority. And in these cases, we may have students that show little remorse, are unwilling to take responsibility, and no matter what we do, they keep cheating. But it's a small percentage. And in the middle of this bell curve, we have the students who are normal. 80 to 90% of students who, if you put them in a difficult situation at a difficult time, they may make a wrong decision. They may make a misstep. And I tell people on this bell curve, I would be normal. I remember cheating when I was 8 years old in school and I copied from an Encyclopedia Britannica and my teacher didn't catch me. I still remember doing it, mostly because I never got caught and I was surprised. But I was looking at something, it was a geography assignment, and I thought, I can't say it any better than this, so I just copied it. So in that case, I felt insecure about my academic abilities. I felt like somebody else had said it better. I was afraid that if I tried to say it in my own words, I wouldn't get as good a mark or I might fail. So there was other things going on, right, in my head. And some of the research that we have around academic misconduct will show that by and large, when students engage in cheating behaviors, it's not because they're bad people, but because they may have made a poor decision or a bad decision at a moment in time. So thinking about academic integrity as a behavior or as a moral construct, and these are different ways of looking at academic integrity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But before I do, just wanted to acknowledge that these definitions that we talk about, there are no universal definitions of academic integrity or plagiarism or misconduct. Our definitions are culturally and contextually and historically bound. And so understanding what we're talking about. And some years back, I looked at policies from Canadian universities, 20 different universities. I looked at their academic misconduct policies and compared their definitions of plagiarism. There was some consistency, usually copying text verbatim, considered plagiarism. That's no surprise. Plagiarism of ideas, stealing other people's ideas, also not a surprise. Difficult to prove that one in an investigation. But some universities, for example, included in their definitions copying and pasting others' computer code, whereas some universities did not include that in their definition of plagiarism. Some included things such as musical composition or design, whereas other universities did not. So what struck me there was a lack of consistency in policy definitions, and yet we all think we're talking about the same thing when we say plagiarism. So being able to understand and unpack, like, what do we mean when we say that? This is one of the reasons with ChatGPT and other AI apps that it's so difficult to understand the idea of plagiarism when it comes to using apps like ChatGPT, because even before ChatGPT hit the market, we still didn't have consistency. And then when we look at how conversations across places might differently define these, we find that it can get messy very quickly. So one thing I might invite you to do is in the meeting chat is think about at your institution. One, do you know how concepts like plagiarism are defined? And have you had debates with colleagues about what might or might not constitute misconduct? So I'll give you an example for plagiarism. I have colleagues who say that if a student misses a page number when they're citing something directly from a text, that's plagiarism. Or if they fail to use quotation marks, that's plagiarism. And I have other colleagues who say, no, that's a typo. The student forgot the quotation marks. That's not plagiarism. It might be sloppy scholarship, but it's not plagiarism. So what are your thoughts on this? What are your ideas about plagiarism, what is and isn't, and their institutional definitions? So it might be a good place to start when you're having these conversations with folks about what do we mean when we say plagiarism? But also, we talked a little bit about the behaviors and values of morality. I wanted to present a couple of cultural framings around academic integrity that may or may not resonate with you and where you are, but to kind of set a framing around this. And I'll do this in an agnostic way. I don't necessarily subscribe or connect with all of these framings, but some of them are quite predominant in the literature. So for example, the International Center for Academic Integrity has these fundamental values that they talk about of courage, honesty, fairness, trust, respect, and responsibility. And these framings have been, they actually updated them. Courage was added, I think, in 2014. They originally started with 5 fundamental values and then came up to 6. Others, some have challenged this framework, saying we could include other ones. I have colleagues in Mexico who are very adamant that compassion should be added as a fundamental value of academic integrity. ICI hasn't taken that up yet. And I've argued that dignity should be included as a value for academic integrity. And that also hasn't been taken up. But this idea of a framework around values. So this is very dominant in US-based conversations around academic integrity, and because we're geographically close, has made its way into policy discourse in Canada and other places as well. Before I mentioned the handbook of academic integrity, one of the chapters that I did in that was with a colleague by the name of Teddy Fishman. And Teddy and I, as we were both teaching in Turkey in 2022 at an academic integrity summer school there at Çanakkale Ansiklesmart University. And we started having these conversations about the differences between academic integrity in the United States and in Canada. And lots of people think that they're the same. But in fact, we have quite different framings around academic integrity. And so this led us to sort of examine some of the literature. There's a large body of literature on this from the United States. And we found sort of 2 dominant discourses in American-based academic integrity writing. One was from folks who are largely affiliated with the International Center for Academic Integrity and those 6 fundamental values. And it's about values and morality and character education and character development. And this idea that if we can cultivate a person's morals, then we can cultivate good behavior. So the idea of morals leading to behavior, this is nothing new. This has existed in psychology for a long time. And you can see lots of the sort of the dominant scholars from this school of thought, if you will, Tricia Bertram-Gallant, Don McCabe, David Rettinger. But there was a different discourse happening at the same time. And that was a group of people, and I mentioned Rebecca Moore Howard earlier, and so I've been influenced by her work. And some of her colleagues, Sandra Jamieson, Lisa Panning Davies, Amy Robillard, they say academic integrity and plagiarism have nothing to do with morality. Let's take the morality out of it. Let's focus on behavior and specifically academic skill development, because we can focus better on developing somebody's academic skills when the question about whether or not they're a good person doesn't come into play. Thanks, Maha, for posting the link there. So this was really interesting for us because Rebecca Moore Howard and Don McCabe were contemporaries in the United States at the same time, both doing the bulk of their writing in the 1990s and early 2000s. Don McCabe was in the state of New Jersey. Rebecca Moore Howard was across the state border line in New York, and they never worked together. They, as far as I know, they never had any debates or conversations. And Don McCabe passed away before I got a chance to talk with him about it. But I did ask Rebecca Moore Howard, I'm like, did you ever work with Don McCabe or have a chance to talk with him about his ideas? And she said no, that they were basically 2 different camps. I know it may be hard to imagine polarized thinking around the United States, but it happens, even with academic integrity. So the 2 of them never had conversations. I think that's kind of a shame that they were never able to at least debate their ideas around this. But we had these 2 polarized skills, right? Yeah. So I might ask you, when you think about academic integrity and plagiarism, do you think it's about morality, or do you think it's about academic skills and behavior? Or is it both? I think in Canada, probably it's a little bit of both, but probably less on the values and morality, right? Maybe depends on the context. Yeah. So these are the one framing, culturally and contextually bound. And wanted to highlight, some of the work we do in Canada and give a shout out to a friend and colleague here, Kita Gladue. Kita is an Indigenous scholar from the Sucker Creek Cree Nation, and also finds her roots in the Métis Nation of Manitoba. And she did a project at the University of Calgary around Indigenous academic integrity, sort of challenging these colonial norms that we've developed. And she developed this iconography at the top with a braid, and the three colors each mean have a different symbolic meaning, and I forget what they are, but I think blue is meant to represent the prairie sky, and yellow is meant to represent wheat, and I forget what the orange one is. I'll have to ask her. But Kita talks about academic integrity quite differently, and she talks about relationality as being fundamental to academic integrity, and I am because you are. And I am because of those who came before me, on whose shoulders I stand and who I've learned from. And she said relationships don't merely shape reality, they are reality, drawing from Sean Wilson's work there, another Indigenous scholar. And she also talks about reciprocity and the roles we serve, and inherent in the commitment to the people is the understanding of reciprocity of life and accountability to one another. I loved this. The accountability to one another as being prioritized over an accountability for rule compliance. This was a very different framing. And when Kita did this project in 2020 and 2021, there was nothing else like it for academic integrity at the time. And then finally, she also talks about respect, but in a very different way from the American framing of respecting the rules, respecting your teacher, respecting the authority, but rather respect as nothing about us without us, and engaging, in this case, Indigenous persons in conversations about integrity, and engaging students in conversations about integrity. And here she draws from Smith's work and says Indigenous knowledge extends beyond the environment. However, it has values and principles about human behavior and ethics, about relationships, about wellness, and leading a good life. Knowledge has beauty and can make the world beautiful if used in a good way. I sat with that for a long time. Knowledge is beautiful. And it made me step back and think about how can we think about academic integrity as a way of teaching our students of the beauty of knowledge. And that may be aspirational, but when I talk about post-plagiarism, these are some of the concepts I'm thinking about as we engage in understandings, or maybe our evolution around academic integrity. So we asked this reflection question a little bit earlier. How are the concepts around academic integrity and plagiarism and cheating defined or understood in your context? And to what extent might concepts such as relationality and reciprocity and respect for one another and the beauty of knowledge be part of those conversations? And much of the discourse that still exists around academic integrity, it's around rule compliance and catching cheaters. I'm not sure that I can reconcile that idea with emphasizing the idea of respecting knowledge, because knowledge is beautiful and it exists because we exist in relation to one another, and knowledge doesn't exist outside of us as humans, or does it? This is a big question we might grapple with as we think about evolving understandings of plagiarism and artificial intelligence. I've talked about this framework before, so I won't spend too much time on it today, but suffice to say that as I sat with Rebecca Moore Howard's challenge to throw out plagiarism from our policy definitions, focus on teaching, I thought, what could replace it? What could replace plagiarism? And I kind of got stuck because there is sort of no replacement for plagiarism that I could think of. And I thought, what if we transcended it in the age of AI? What would that look like? So this became a conceptual framework, and it was a thinking point. And I wanted to give a shout out here to my colleague Rahul Kumar has actually taken this framework, and he shared his work with me, and I'm thrilled that he did it. It's just being published now. But he took these 6 tenets of plagiarism and the sentences within them, he called them constructs, and then he developed a survey around them and surveyed people around each of them to say, do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? Do you think this is true? And so on. And the idea of human AI writing becoming normal, a hybrid action in which we can co-create with AI. And I know that others have talked about co-creation even co-intelligence with AI, but the idea of writing being constructed such that in the end, we may not know where the AI begins or ends. We may not know where the human begins or ends. And is that important to us? In the end, it may not be important. And this was me also trying to think in the future, being future forward and what might future generations face. And having a background in literature, when I went to university, we were allowed to use typewriters. We were allowed to handwrite our papers. We were not allowed to use computers. And if a paper was turned in that looked like it had been done on a computer processor, word processor, which at the time, I'm dating myself now, but bear with me, had paper down the sides. You may remember this if you're around my age, that you had to pull away because it had all these little dots on it from the printer, right? And you pulled away those perforated edges. So the teachers could tell if your paper came from one of those printers because of the edges on it, and they wouldn't accept the papers because they felt that interacting with a word processor or a computer would interfere with our intellectual ability to engage with the literature text we were stealing. Yes, dot matrix printer, that's it. It was it, that's it. And so they wouldn't accept it. We'd have to go back and rewrite it. So this idea of like what was acceptable when I was a student, what was not acceptable, what is acceptable today with students, and thinking ahead to next generations. And this doesn't exist within the Indigenous cultures in Western Canada as much as it does in Eastern Canada. So I'll just acknowledge Indigenous cultures as not being a monolith. But in the Eastern Canadian and North American contexts, in some Indigenous cultures like Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, there's the idea of thinking 7 generations ahead and thinking and planning for the earth and the learning and the people, not for the people of today or even the people of tomorrow, but of 7 generations ahead. I was thinking about that when I thought about post-plagiarism. What might things look like 7 generations from now? Of course, I have no answer, but it helped me to think about the ways in which technology may or may not affect things like creativity, our human ability to create and inspire others, how it may or may not help us overcome language barriers. And Maha was very instrumental in helping me refine my thinking around this tenet. And then when it comes to misconduct, the idea right now of humans being accountable for the work that we submit to teachers, to bosses, to journals, and we are responsible for the content. And so we can relinquish some of the control if we want to an AI app to help us, to assist us, but we don't relinquish control or responsibility. We can relinquish some control, but not responsibility. In the end, the work that our students submit to us is their responsibility. Just as the way the work that we submit to journals as scholars is our responsibility. So the idea of being really clear about outsourcing as a relinquishing of control, and whether the outsourcing is to a person or an AI, but we're not relinquishing or outsourcing responsibility. So we don't outsource accountability in that sense. So this is crucial for academic integrity, and that attribution remains important. And the more that I do plagiarism work, the more annoyed I get with the technical minutiae of citing and referencing according to prescribed systems. I grew up with these. I grew up with having to learn MLA because I was in humanities. And then I went to education where I had to learn APA. And that was kind of an academic trauma in a way, because I sort of had to unlearn and disavow, if you will, everything to do with MLA and take up this new citing and referencing system around API and memorize the rules. And I was really lousy at it for a long time. And then, of course, you get new editions and there's new rules, right? And the great debate, if you were also trained in APA, and I think it was between editions 5 and 6 or 6 and 7, where, oh my goodness, the number of spaces after a period became a